Well, the new head of the Australian Banks Association has taken a swipe at the seemingly cosy relationship between the corporate regulator and some of the big banks. The Australian newspaper has revealed through Freedom of Information that ASIC regularly bowed to demands from big banks to water down the language it used in press releases about banks' wrongdoing. Anna Bligh was today marking the release of a review into retail banking remuneration, which demands banks scrap incentives, commissions and bonus payments for retail staff selling products to customers. I spoke with Ms Bligh earlier. Anna Bligh, today the retail banking remuneration review was delivered. It's recommended that the incentives paid to bank workers be dramatically reduced. If this had happened earlier, what scandals do you think could have been prevented?
This report recommends the decoupling of financial incentives in salary packages from direct individual sales targets. It represents one of the biggest step changes in banking culture in a very long time. I think it's important to understand that how much culture in any organisation impacts on behaviour. I don't think it's possible to say that this leads directly to that in any particular complaint, but what this review does is really start taking big steps to shifting the culture in Australian banks from a sales culture to a customer culture, and I think that's what Australian customers want to see.
It recommends that the incentives should be not so much linked to people's salaries but to overall targets that are broader to do with banks or regions, etc. But how exactly are banks then going to measure the performance of its employees and make money, because after all they have to sell products?
This report recommends that the performance of bank employees should be done on a broad range of performance issues. Of course, these are commercial organisations, and it does recommend there be a financial dimension, or there can be a financial dimension to that, but only up to 33% of performance. The rest has to be looking at outcomes for customers, customer experience, and getting the ethical behaviour of the entire organisation right.
And how does a bank measure, and how would the author of the report, Sedgwick, like to see those sorts of customer outcomes actually be measured? Because if you went to someone who had, say, bought a CommInsure product 3 or 4 years after they'd bought it, they would have thought it was a great product until they got sick, and then they found out it was a terrible product.
There may not be any single measure that is absolute precision, but what this report makes it very clear is that sales targets, even though they might be precise, are not the only appropriate way to measure performance. And in fact, if it's the only way you measure it, then you are at high risk of getting a bad outcome for your customer, and that exposes the bank to not only reputational but financial risk. So banks need to take this seriously.
So
They've said they'll support the recommendations.
What kind of penalties are there going to be? Are there going to be any?
This report recommends that if these proposals are not implemented within a reasonable time frame, basically over the next 2.5 years, that the government should provide sufficient powers for ASIC for them to intervene into salary arrangements in banks. So the industry has really got one chance to get this right. They've got one opportunity to put these recommendations in place in a way that's demonstrable, and frankly in a way that customers and their staff can really feel it. If they fail in that task, then there is a recommendation for a regulatory response. The banks have today indicated they will support all these recommendations. Their task now is to prove all the sceptics wrong.
Freedom of Information documents published by the Australian today show that the corporate regulator ASIC has watered down press releases about bank wrongdoing after discussions with banks. Does this show that the regulator and the banks are too close?
Frankly, I think that the public and the whole system needs to have confidence that regulators are completely independent from the institutions they regulate. The Australian banking system is a strong one. It is well regulated, but I think the reports today would alarm many people, and I'm not aware of these any particular instances of this, but if there is evidence of it, then I do think it will erode public confidence that regulators are sufficiently arm's length from the institutions they regulate.
So the practice of ASIC sending press releases to the bank concerned, involved in any kind of wrongdoing that ASIC has found, for them to check it, that should stop?
I think on the one hand there's a role to make sure that any public statements by the regulator are factually correct, but I think there is no role for banks to play in affecting the tone, the message, the content of any statement from the regulator.
Turning to housing, which is of course a hot topic for the banks, the RBA has warned that a third of borrowers are essentially one paycheck away from default, and as rates continue to rise, which they're expected to, that number will only grow. What are banks doing to prepare for that?
Banks are monitoring what's happening in the market very closely. They've already in some cases moved to pull some levers, particularly in relation to investor and interest-only investor loans, to dampen demand for some of those products. But this is a very rapidly moving beast at the moment, and I know that banks are monitoring their lending practices very carefully, but I also know that the regulators have got their eye on them.
And just finally, the government has changed the parameters around the 457 visas. A lot of businesses, particularly banks, have brought in technology workers on those sorts of visas. Do you see that this is going to be an issue for the industry?
There are a number of sectors of the economy that are effectively global labour markets now, and without doubt technology is one of those. As customers of banks, we all want our banks to be able to invest in and put in place the best technology. And I would hate to think that any inability from Australian banks to get the best technology talent would limit our ability for customers to see that great outcome.
Anna Bligh, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.